Good afternoon and happy Sabbath to everybody. And this is another installment of our class in the bunker. Again, we continue to be so pleased at the response, and the amount of people that have come and joined us and been part of this is just fantastic, far beyond anything that we actually could have hoped might happen. Now, as we begin, just a reminder, if you want to get a copy of the PowerPoint for this class, I try and send this out the day before. Just simply go to kevinhinkley.com, get on the mailing list, and we'll send out the PowerPoint. Now, disclaimer, there are times, and this was one of them, where I sent it out yesterday and then had some more brainstorms overnight and made a couple of changes. So if you're sitting there with PowerPoint, be aware that I might have made a couple of changes since then, or I'm just going off script. Either one could easily possibly happen. So, all right, well, to begin, I want to start with a principle that I discovered a long time ago in my counseling practice. And that is that one of the things that I hear quite a bit is, I can't believe I did what I did. Why was I so stupid? What was I thinking? And people ruing and wishing they had done something else. I really hear it when it comes to people struggling with some kind of addiction, like pornography, where they're saying, I promised everybody I would do A, and I did B. And I just can't believe that I did it. And then they struggle with that. Well, as it turns out, part of what we're going to talk about today is when we get to the very heart of what Paul taught and the very heart of what he believed, we're gonna hear a very powerful man with very strong weaknesses and mourning over the fact that he wished he knew one thing and did another, and it just is driving him crazy. And there ought to be some real humanness there in this for us. Now, as we look at this then, so here's the pattern that I find, is that a lot of times then we'll look at our daily choices and wish we had done something different, and more than that, wondering, how did I do something different? I know better, and I did something different, completely different, okay? Well, part of what we begin to find, you take a look at your daily choices, and what we choose to do, whether they are small decisions of really no consequence, or even the larger decisions about what we do for work, who we marry, whether we didn't, whether we struggle with this or that, actually comes arcing back to taking a look at our identity. And that is our internal narrative that drives us, that forms, this is who I am compared to somebody else. This is my identity, and people with this identity do this. People with this identity don't do this. They do that, but I don't do that, because this is me and this is what I do, and so I do basically who I am. And I'm always taking a look at this and wanting people to understand, I need you to see exactly what your identity is according to what you think. Now, fascinating part of that is always, how did this get to be my identity? How did I get there? And the key to that then is that we then go back and we take a look at the stories of our life. Think about all of the millions of events that happen to you over the course of your lifetime. Of all the things that have ever happened to you, which ones do you remember? Which ones do you not? Which ones are of consequence? Which ones aren't? And what we find is that the events and things that we do in our life, in order for it to be paired into our brain that only has so much space in its hard drive, it has to have some kind of emotional content that binds that to your brain. So really it's the emotional things, the emotional stories of our life that cause us to decide what our identity is or isn't. And then based off of that knowledge base, when we have to make a decision going forward, we're going to take a look at who I am, and that will dictate what I'm supposed to be doing. A quick example that I always give is somebody that has some very emotional failures in early school around math, and it just drove them crazy and they couldn't get it, or someone was yelling at them, or they felt stupid, and their identity ends up being, well, I'm a person who doesn't do math. I'm just not good at math. I don't do math. Great. Okay, so now if I'm going to go forward and say, are you going to go to school? Are you going to go off to college after high school? You might look at it and say, well, I would go to college, but hey, I don't do math. Remember, I'm not a math person. So I'm going to, if I am going to college, I'm going to eliminate these majors because they don't fit me, and I'm going to actually do these things that are low on math. And part of what happens then in the process of counseling is oftentimes we're looking at and saying, oftentimes these stories are fake news. They were based on a different time and place and childhood memories, but they help form that identity, that story of how you see yourself. And we have to start challenging this story, this overall arching life story, before we actually begin to change our daily choices. Now, fascinatingly enough, that's going to be at the heart of what Paul is trying to do. And as we're going to find, it was also at the heart of what Nephi was trying to do. If you've been following along on Come Follow Me, there are going to be a couple of things today that really jump out. So let's take a look at, first of all, how it happened in places in the Book of Mormon, and then we're going to look at what Paul is trying to say to the Romans, because he's wanting them to change their overall identity about who they are, and that will affect their choices as to whether or not they join this way, this Christ follower kind of thing. They're going to have to, their identity is going to have to be changed in order to do that. So let's go to the prophet Nephi for just a second. The prophet Nephi, remember his father in 1 Nephi 8 has a vision, and it's a dream. And you remember that for Nephi, he really wants to know that dream. He wants to know what it all meant. So now we get later in 11, 12, and 13, 14, here's Nephi's grand vision of things. And for him, for Lehi, that 1 Nephi 8 was probably mostly about Laman and Lemuel and their descendants. When Nephi is looking at it, he's getting an expanded view. And in that expanded view, he's taking a look at everything that's going to happen, not just to his descendants, but to the lands of the Gentiles and what the Gentiles are going to do. And it's where he's going to see Columbus, and he's going to see the establishment of the nation and all that. And so in 1 Nephi 11, we're going to get this little phrase, this little section. As he's looking ahead, he can see what's going to happen. And Nephi says, "And it came to pass that I, Nephi, beheld that the Gentiles, those coming from Europe, who were coming into the New World, the Gentiles did prosper in the land, and I beheld a book, and it was carried forth among them." So these particular set of Gentiles had a book with them that guided them and it directed them. And the angel said unto me, "Knowest the meaning of this book?" And Nephi says, "No, I don't know it." Look at how the angel describes this book. Now, let me stop. We know this is the Bible. and we would say, what exactly is the Bible's purpose? What is it supposed to do? Why do we have this Bible? What purpose does it serve? And listen to what the angel says the purpose of the Bible is. He says, "Behold, it proceedeth forth out of the mouth of a Jew." This is a Jewish book, he says. It proceedeth forth out of the mouth of a Jew. Well, there's a couple of Jews that are pretty involved in putting this thing together. The writer of Luke and Acts is probably a big contributor, but nobody contributes nearly as much as a Jew, Paul. So I picture this and I say, it proceedeth out of the mouth of a Jew, the most prominent Jew being Paul in what we're looking at. Now, I, Nephi, beheld it, and he said unto me, "The book which thou beholdest is a record of the Jews." What's the purpose of this book? It contains the covenants of the Lord. That's its purpose. This book contains the covenant of the Lord which he hath made unto the house of Israel. Think about if you go to the title page of the Book of Mormon, what is the purpose of the Book of Mormon? You open up that title page and there are two main purposes to the Book of Mormon, Mormon says. One is to convince everybody that's going to read this that Jesus is the Christ. Certainly that was Paul's intent in his writings, especially Romans. But there's a second purpose to the Book of Mormon, and that is to let the descendants, the remnants of their people, especially the Lamanites, know the promises that was made by God to their fathers. Laman and Lemuel, Lehi, Jacob, Isaac, Abraham. The promises, he says promises, it's the covenants of the Lord which he has made to the house of Israel, is the purpose of the Book of Mormon, and those same two promises that Jesus is the Christ and that the Lord has made promises and covenants with the house of Israel is what is contained in the Bible. And we're going to see Paul trying to ram that idea home and change the identity of how Gentiles see themselves as potential Israelites who are heirs to promises and covenants. And that's why it's so totally, tightly bound to the Book of Mormon, I believe. But something important happens here, and Nephi's going to point this out. They are of great worth to the Gentiles. This was of great worth to the Romans, but it was of great worth to the people in Zarahemla, and is great worth to the people today, the Gentiles. But listen to what Nephi is going to say. Wherefore, these things, or the angel, these things come forth from the Jews in purity. At the moment these things were written, they were pure. Unto the Gentiles, according to the truth which is in God. God had gave them the truth. They were given to the Jews in purity, and they wrote it down. Now, that works, except for something happens. There's a disconnect here. And after they had gone forth by the hand of the 12 apostles of the Lamb from the Jews unto the Gentiles, what happens? And we know this, right? The Gentiles have taken away from the gospel of the Lamb many parts which are plain and precious, and many covenants of the Lord they have taken away. So somewhere in the editing process, what he's saying is, as they wrote, plain and precious truths were taken out. Now, the plain and precious truths originally were the covenants and the promises. And what that meant to who we are and what we're supposed to do and what the Lord expects of us, all of that. But he's going to say many covenants of the Lord they have taken away. And we were always, anciently, decades ago, we were really quick to say, yes, it's that great and abominable church. Must be that Catholic Church that took all these things away. If you listen closely, what he's saying is before it ever got to the Catholic Church, the precious truths that were already gone. They had already been edited out and removed. As Hugh Nibley, the patron saint of BYU, used to say, it's like you hear a dark, muffled sound going on in a room in the 1st century, and things are tumbling around, and then what emerges in the 3rd century is kind of a pared down version of things. But part of what the angel's trying to tell Nephi, and what Nephi is going to want Jacob and prophets long after him, is make sure that my people know their identity. Make sure they know who they are. These words coming from a Jew to the Gentiles are going to be the same promises made to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and they're there in Isaiah. They're there in Jeremiah. They're there in Daniel. Because like we were talking about last time, when the Apostle Paul's going to go off to preach in Ephesus and Corinth and now Rome, and he wants them desperately to know that Jesus is the Christ, and he's going to say, according to the Scriptures. Well, what Scriptures does he have? It's all Old Testament. According to the Old Testament and the prophecies there, this Messiah hung on a tree is the promised Messiah. And he's now the king. The revolution has begun. And this is part of what was restored in the Book of Mormon, was to try and put some of those plain and precious truths about the covenants and promises made. Now, as we start looking forward then, let's now move, but watch what role the Book of Mormon begins to play for us as we take a closer look at what Paul is going to try and say to those that are going to be reading his words. Now, we talked about before that of all of Paul's writings, his whole corpus that we have available to us, I would think most scholars, and certainly LDS scholars, have said the most doctrinally powerful, the most beautifully rich, important book that he ever produced was the book of Romans. And we've talked the last couple of times how